Way back in January of 2022, I posted a video exploring the development timelines of the Pokémon series. This was in response to pre-release footage of Pokémon Legends Arceus, which, from a purely graphical perspective, left a lot to be desired. In it, I explored the insanely short amount of time that the Pokémon Company gives Game Freak to develop these games, and how, as the games become more and more complex, this problem is only going to get worse. Shortly after that video came out, Pokémon Arceus released. Yes, it was ugly, but it had so many incredible ideas sitting just below the surface, and it looking somewhat unfinished ultimately didn't stop it from being fun. What I couldn't have imagined at the time was that Arceus wasn't the only Pokémon game that Game Freak was working on at the time, and another, even bigger RPG would come out later that year in Pokémon Scarlet and Violet. And this is where all of my concerns ultimately came to pass. Because while Arceus looked a little ugly but ultimately played fine, Pokémon Scarlet and Violet not only looked ugly, but also crashed on me 11 times within the first week of playing them. Add to that a near constant drip feed of smaller bugs, some funny, some debilitating, and I was left with a game that I just couldn't convince myself to finish. Which was a bummer because underneath all of that, I loved what Game Freak was trying to do. I think the underlying game design of Pokémon Scarlet and Violet is brilliant, but I just wasn't having fun playing it because it was, by any definition, broken. Now, if you played through Scarlet and Violet and your experience was smooth, that's great. I'm not trying to invalidate you having fun, and I wish I could have joined you. All I can speak to is my experience playing the game, and clearly based on talking to others, including my own wife, I wasn't alone in this experience. With that in mind, you may expect me to look at the newly announced Pokémon Legends Z-A. Have we decided how we're saying this title yet? No? Alright. Pokémon Legends Z is what I'm going with. You may expect me to look at Pokémon Legends Z and pronounce that it will be the next step in the death spiral of Pokémon's technical quality. But I'm not going to do that. In fact, I'm cautiously optimistic about Legends Z. And that optimism is based on the exact same math that allowed me to express concern over Scarlet and Violet before they had even been announced. So what's the difference between Legends Z and 2022's Pokémon Trinity of Arceus, Scarlet, and Violet? Well, there are 3 key points I want to take a look at: time, resources, and environment. First up, time. Pokémon Sword and Shield's last DLC, the Crown Tundra, released in October of 2020. Pokémon Legends Arceus released in January of 2022. Not factoring in the gold dates of either one, that's roughly 15 months between the end of Sword and Shield's content and the launch of Legends Arceus, and 25 months for Scarlet and Violet. Now, of course, we know that neither of those 2022 titles actually started development right when Sword and Shield DLC wrapped. Rather, the teams were split, and some stayed to work on DLC, while the others left to work on those other 2 games. Surely, the company that makes Pokémon games is pretty big and has the staff to develop 2 brand new open-world RPGs while another team works on DLC for a previous game. Right? Well, here's where we get to resources. At last estimate in 2023, Game Freak had 212 employees. We don't know exactly how many people worked on each project, and once Sword and Shield DLC was done, those developers would inevitably have moved to the other 2 games. What we do have, however, is the credits for both Arceus and Scarlet and Violet. Of the reported 212 employees at Game Freak, 119 were shared between both of these games. That means as far as splitting these up into separate projects, they had at best about 46 dedicated staff on each game. Once again, that's more of a percentage estimate than an actual count. I'm assuming Game Freak's employees include some janitors and things that aren't game developers, but you get the point. Now, anyone who's paid attention to these games' development knows that it's not actually just the people at Game Freak making these games. Both of these games made extensive use of both third and first-party development support partners to bolster their numbers. Scarlet and Violet in particular appears to have been handled about in equal parts by both Game Freak and outside help. But that's where we get into the second element of resources that we're seeing across the industry right now. Quick temporary hires to get a game out on time do not yield the same quality as artists who have been with a project for a very long time. Artists who know your game, assets, and engine inside out. It's why Monolith Soft or the Zelda team can take their time and make the Nintendo Switch sing while Game Freak is left outsourcing half their development to hit impossible deadlines, and we wind up with Scarlet and Violet. To be clear, this isn't to question the ability of these support studios, but they're being roped into an impossible situation by the Pokémon Company, just like Game Freak already is. Finally, we come to environment, and something that I embarrassingly didn't even think about when working on that Arceus video back in 2022, is that all of the 2022 Pokémon games were developed during pandemic lockdowns. Both for Game Freak and their development partners, the huge working environment shifts would have massively affected the development speed of both games, meaning that realistically, that already short development time was essentially cut even shorter. But as I did mention in that video, Pokémon games don't really get delayed, so regardless of lockdowns and plagues, those games had to launch on time. Now, hopefully between these three factors, you can see why I feel Legends Arceus, along with Scarlet and Violet, were essentially impossible tasks. The fact that Game Freak delivered these games at all by the Pokémon Company's deadline, and especially that Arceus was just kinda ugly but ultimately ran fine, is incredible. But I can't really be surprised that Scarlet and Violet in particular were in the state that they were at launch. Now, this didn't really affect sales. By the end of 2023, Scarlet and Violet had sold around 24 million copies. In fact, they had the highest launch sales of any platform-exclusive game in the history of video games. Unfortunately, it was also reportedly the most refunded game in the history of the Pokémon franchise. My concern is that I've long felt you can sell a bad game once, but the next game would need to prove to consumers burned by the prior entry that something had changed. So let's talk about why I think Legends Z might just do exactly that, using the same metrics that doomed its predecessors. First up, time. The last DLC for Scarlet and Violet was a short epilogue DLC which amounted to maybe 2 hours of gameplay at most. The last substantial DLC that would have had a significant development team released in December of 2023. As stated previously, the core games released in November of 2022. As for Legends Z, all we know right now is that it will release sometime in 2025. The vast majority of Pokemon RPGs release in November, though the previous Pokemon Legends game did release in January. So we've got a potential range there. Assuming Legends Z is being helmed by the team who were exclusive to Legends Arceus, which makes sense to me, and then later joined by the Scarlet and Violet team, Legends Z would have entered initial development around February of 2022. If it is indeed the only Pokemon RPG releasing in 2025, then historical precedent would say it would release in November, but once again, that's not guaranteed. But let's play it out. If it releases in November, that would mean that it would have been in development for 45 months, or just shy of 4 years. That would be the longest development time for any Pokemon RPG ever. Even releasing in, say, March would still put it right at that record. And it will have had the full Game Freak team completely done with their work on Scarlet and Violet for 2 years. So really, regardless of whether it's early 2025 or later 2025, this might be the longest Game Freak has ever had to develop a Pokemon game. Now let's talk about resources. Assuming the Pokemon Company doesn't do what they did in 2022 and announce multiple Pokemon RPGs are coming out in 2025, Legends Z will have the full attention of the entire team. Now, we can't be sure, but there is one small fact that makes me think that the Pokemon Company forcing out another RPG that year is unlikely. As far as we know, mainline Pokemon is skipping 2024. Yes, they could still announce a Black and White remake, but if we take the Diamond and Pearl remakes as precedent, those were announced at the same time as Legends Arceus, during a Pokemon Day video just like Legends Z was. If we were getting remakes this November, I'd have expected to hear about them by now. Now, once again, that's not guaranteed, but that's what historical precedent would tell me. To me, this reads as a reaction to Scarlet and Violet, which, once again, while they sold very well, they were somewhat poorly received by critics and fans compared to the rest of the series. The Pokemon Company knows they need to earn back trust or risk the franchise suffering long-term damage. Finally, we have environment, and this one should be pretty obvious. We've come out of a global pandemic. Game development for Game Freak is presumably back to normal, or as back to normal as it can be when you're churning out Pokemon games at this pace. The time lost to lockdowns and adaptation during the 2022 Pokemon games won't be the case this time around. once again hammering home that these games may very well have more development time than any previous Pokémon RPG. Now, I'm not guaranteeing or even really saying that Legend Z will be the best looking video game you've ever seen. I'd honestly like to see these games be given even more time, but this is a step forward in my opinion, and exactly the response I'd hoped I'd see from the Pokémon Company when I made that video on Arceus 2 years ago. We don't know much about Legend Z itself outside of taking place entirely within Lumiose City, known for its appearances in Pokémon X and Y, but I'm extremely excited to see what Game Freak can do with more development time, hopefully their full team, and fingers crossed, no plagues. But that's all I've got for today. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and consider subscribing to Nintendo World Report TV. If you'd like to get in contact with me, you can reach out on your social media platform of choice using the handle on screen, and if you want to chat with myself and a whole bunch of other people about anything Nintendo, you can join our Discord using the link in the description. Check out NintendoWorldReport.com for a whole lot more, and of course, expect more coverage of Pokémon Legends Z and all things Nintendo from us right here at Nintendo World Report. My name's John Raridan, and I will see you next time. This video is made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Did you know that Nintendo World Report is funded directly by fans like you? When you support Nintendo World Report on Patreon, you get immediate access to multiple exclusive podcasts every month, exclusive Discord channels, an early look at select content, and more, all for as little as $1 a month. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details.